This is HuffPost Live. I'm Josh Sepps. President Obama met today at the White House with the President of South Korea, Park Geun-hye.
That the commitment of the United States to the defense and security of the Republic of Korea will never waver. Our alliance remains a linchpin of peace and security, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but across the region. And so South Korea plays a central role in America's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, and we continued that work today.
With the Obama administration's so-called pivot to Asia, South Korea is one of America's two indispensable, big, rich, democratic allies, along with Japan. But as China asserts itself and as North Korea gets no less volatile, where is this crucial bilateral relationship headed? Joining us are Carl Friedhoff, fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Scott Harrell, Deputy Director of Asia-Pacific Policy at RAND Corporation, and Sam Cho, an analyst at Global Risk Insights. Thanks to all of you for being here, and feel free to jump into the conversation whenever you want to. But Scott, maybe you could just kick us off, because obviously at the top of the agenda is North Korea. How are things between Seoul and Pyongyang these days?
Well, Seoul has really shown its strength. Seoul has really shown its strength in the August dust-up when North Korea emplaced two landmines that maimed two South Korean soldiers. The South was then very firm in responding by blaring messages into the North. The North then fired at the South. The South then returned fire in a very strong way. And so actually the North has backed down and is now appearing to try to curry favor with the South. I think right now you'd have to say the South has shown and reinforced its deterrent capabilities. Along with the United States, it continues to maintain a ready state against North Korean aggression. And so right now I think things are pretty strong, but there's always room for more improvement, both on the part of the South and on the part of the U.S.-South Korean alliance.
Are you confident that there's a comfortable status quo, if that's ever possible, with North Korea? In other words, that while our attention is being paid on the Middle East and to what's going on in Syria and to our relationships with China and to the economy and so on, that we can sort of turn a blind eye from North Korea? Or is this something that we have to be permanently vigilant about?
No, you're absolutely right. We never can afford to turn a blind eye to North Korea. And in fact, the U.S.-South Korean alliance is by no means doing that. It's continuing to engage in numerous efforts to strengthen the relationship, including by helping the South Koreans develop additional military capabilities, including by testing and exercising those capabilities. The North is not itself standing still, as we've seen this. The North is attempting to continue to develop its cyber capabilities, to develop its weapons of mass destruction and its associated delivery systems, including claiming to have recently tested a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And so the U.S. and South Korea really have an imperative to continually be watchful, be monitoring the North, and to continue upgrading their own capabilities and preparing countermeasures for what the North is trying to develop.
I just want to take a look at what President Obama had to say about North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Take a look at this.
Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs have achieved nothing except to deepen North Korea's isolation. Today, President Park and I are reaffirming that our nations will never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. At the same time, we do support President Park's efforts to improve relations between South and North Korea. As my administration has shown with Iran and with Cuba, we are also prepared to engage nations with which we've had troubled histories. But Pyongyang needs to understand that it will not achieve the economic development it seeks so long as it clings to nuclear weapons.
Sam, the White House released a joint statement with South Korea today saying basically the same thing that we just heard the president say. Is it likely to budge anything in North Korea?
Well, look, I mean, if we look at the context of what's happened in the past year, the president mentioned our relations with Cuba, has gone through a 180-degree turn. We've recently had an Iran nuclear deal. And so if you're going through a checklist of things, you're thinking, what's next on the list? Oh, North Korea. But we have to remember that in 2012, President Obama did actually negotiate with North Korea, with Secretary Clinton at the time, and they did reach an agreement. And what happened was North Korea ended up launching a missile for a supposed satellite. And so, people are overly harsh about the Obama administration kind of putting North Korea on the back burner, but we have to remember that there's been attempts in this administration to engage with North Korea. Now, does that mean that we can expect something in the next year? I think that would be overly optimistic, but we're just going to have to wait and see. There's only a year left in this administration, and it's doubtful that anything productive will come out of it.
I don't remember, Sam, whether it was an article that I read of yours or by someone else, but I read a piece basically saying that there's no way to expect a détente with North Korea, because to have a détente, you need an interlocutor who's actually willing to talk to you and who is willing to be moderately rational.
Right.
The only reason why Iran happened and the only reason why Cuba happened was because fundamentally those regimes were able to be brought to the table with a certain modicum of goodwill and trust, and that just doesn't seem to be apparent at all in Pyongyang.
That's exactly right. And if we go even further back into the 90s, in 94, the Clinton administration negotiated a nuclear arms deal, and in the early 2000s, that broke down as well. So North Korea has a far longer history of these negotiations. This is what North Korea does, and it hasn't changed under Kim Jong-un's reign, right? They come to the negotiating table, they negotiate something, and then they take a step back, and then they come back, they negotiate something, and they take a step back. This is a pattern that we've been seeing for the last several decades.
Carl, you've got a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently saying that what should really top the agenda in this meeting between the South Korean president and President Obama is South Korea's relationship with China. Why is that?
Well, what has been happening, I think, there's a lot of concern that South Korea's warming relations with China are actually undermining U.S. interest in the region. There's been an issue of President Park going to the military parade and being photographed and shown next to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They have so far refused to put a THAAD battery, a missile defense battery, in Seoul because of China's objections. And so the hardliners in D.C. are worried that U.S. interests are going to be undermined. I think South Korea needs to address this and make it very clear that there are limitations on the South Korea-China relationship. And the only reason that they're really focusing on China is because of the strength of the U.S. and South Korea alliance. When we look at some of our survey data that we produce here at the Chicago Council, and one of the things that shows is that the South Korean public is really focused on the economic relationship with China. And as this starts to develop, anytime there's economic turmoil, which there recently was in China, it's going to reverberate in South Korea. As we see Chinese companies start to challenge Korean companies, both in China and abroad, the threat perception of the Chinese economy in South Korea is going to be on the rise. So I think that's going to place a natural limit on South Korea-China relations. And President Park Geun-hye, I think, needs to explain that, because there is a danger of South Korea being pushed around, I think, by the hardliners in D.C. that are misinterpreting South Korea's intentions.
She needs to explain that to whom? You mean to people here in D.C., not to her own countrymen?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's broad support in South Korea for her to pursue good relations because South Korea exports 25% of its total exports go to China. So she needs to be clear in that explanation in Washington with the people who are criticizing her right now.
Right, just saying this is not a big geopolitical alignment that we're having with Beijing. It's simply pragmatism, economic pragmatism.
Right, it's pragmatic, and there's no public support in South Korea for it to turn into a security relationship or a political relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like my home country of Australia as well, has a very affectionate economic relationship with China, but you would never suggest that Canberra is in bed with Beijing politically or ideologically.
That's exactly right.
There was a piece in the journal that I saw. You just mentioned THAAD, right? Can you just elaborate on that? So here's this piece: missile defense for Korea. The US and its ally can deploy a new system unless China gets a veto. This piece says that North Korea could have as many as 100 nuclear bombs within 5 years and may already be able to mount warheads on missiles capable of reaching the United States. But there is this system, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense, THAAD, which could thwart it. How?
Well, the question is, placing that THAAD battery in Seoul is not really going to protect South Korea. It's more for protection of the U.S. homeland. China is worried that the radar extends past North Korea and into China, and therefore it's going to be used to detect Chinese missile launches. Of course, it'll still detect North Korean missile launches, but the response time to shoot down a North Korean missile using THAAD is incredibly short, almost so short as to make it impossible. So that's where also there's been quite a bit of pressure on South Korea as well, the fact that it has kind of demurred on placing this battery. And I should mention that so far the United States has not made an official request to actually place it in South Korea, but those discussions are ongoing. So there is going to be some concern, and there's even support to put it among the South Korean public to start to roll this out. But of course, the concern is with China and how this is going to undermine U.S. interests.
Scott, on the economic question of the economic relationship between the United States and South Korea and China, it occurs to me that something that they presumably discussed today was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has just been wrapped up, this big trade deal between the nations of the Pacific Rim that excludes China. Is there anything that we need to know about South Korea's position on that?
Well, one thing to say about that is that South Korea itself is quote-unquote excluded, but South Korea has expressed its interest in potentially joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement.
Why was that? I wasn't aware that it wasn't part of the agreement. Why would you include Japan and Thailand and Singapore and Brunei and Malaysia and Indonesia, but not South Korea?
Countries, this is a common misconception, countries have to express an interest in and a desire to join during the negotiation process. And the South Koreans were not certain whether they wanted to join, in part because this would essentially represent a multilateralization of a South Korea-Japan bilateral FTA. In other words, every country that joins TPP is essentially signing up to an FTA with the other 11 members. And Japan and Korea, as you probably know, have not had the best of relationship recently. But if I could just go back to something your other commentator said, I would say that I think it is a slight mischaracterization of the views in D.C. About THAAD, this Terminal High Altitude Aerial Defense System. A, is not only favored by hardliners, and B, actually represents about if memory serves, about a 35-second window to take a shot. That is substantially an improvement over South Korea's current PAC-2 batteries, which were imported from Germany, which give them about a 4-second window. And there are actual importances in doing the layering in missile defense. This is a system that operates at the point when a ballistic missile, is re-entering from the exoatmospheric point, and therefore would be very important for South Korea to potentially consider. The Chinese argument is essentially, don't get this missile system, because if you do, then we can't shoot missiles at you. We in Beijing have the ability to target South Korea currently, and if you put up a shield, then we feel threatened. It's an argument that's a little bit hard to wrap one's mind around.
Scott, you mentioned the fractious relationship between Japan and South Korea. Can you just explain that to people who haven't been keeping an eye on it?
Sure, of course. This stems from a very unfortunate part of East Asian history, when Japan invaded a number of its neighbors in the early part of the 21st century, occupied Korea and annexed it in 1910, basically abolished Korean names, tried to abolish Korean language and culture, and of course used large numbers of Korean women for sexual services for the Imperial Armed Forces, as well as importing large numbers of Japanese onto the peninsula to do things like agriculture and secret police work and a number of human rights abuses, really quite terrible history. The Japanese, like most countries, do not do the greatest job of teaching the more controversial or more unfortunate parts of their own history. And the Koreans, quite understandably, say, we want to see everyone in Japan know the history of what you did in our country. And so this has been a contentious issue. There have been apologies, numerous apologies from the Japanese to the Koreans, but many of those occurred during a period of military dictatorship in Korea. Unfortunately, that military dictatorship was started under Park Geun-hye's father, which makes it a particularly difficult relationship for her to manage, because the opposition in South Korea can then point at her and say, well, anything you do that's favorable towards Japan is just because your dad had a good relationship with the Japanese. He was, in fact, trained as an Imperial Japanese police officer. And so it's a very difficult period the last 3 years. I think that President Park, to her credit, has shown that she is willing to move forward. There is going to be a trilateral China, Japan, Korea meeting held in Seoul at the start of November, and that's something the South Koreans have called for and may present an option for forward progress in the Japan-Korea relationship.
Yeah, Carl, are you looking for anything in particular to come out of that trilateral meeting? I assume that these are the three biggest economies in Asia, right? China, Japan, and South Korea?
Right. I'm not looking for anything specific to come out of that. I think it's more damage control. Apart from what was said previously, I think the fact that Park Geun-hye is in this situation is mostly of her own doing. She came out very early in her administration, and she said that she would be ready and willing to meet Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, at any moment, but she would under no circumstances meet Prime Minister Abe unless he kind of revised his position on history and had a quote-unquote correct understanding. So this is really damage control for her. She was backed into a corner. She saw Prime Minister Abe go to Washington and give a speech in front of Congress. She saw him start to perhaps warm relations with China, and she was really kind of the country left out. And so now she's had pressure from the United States privately, and so now that's why this trilateral is coming about. There was quite a bit of pressure put on her to start to correct this, and so it's more of a measure just to show that something is happening, but I don't anticipate any major delivery. Prime Minister Abe has said that he's not going to visit the Yasukuni coming up, but other than that, I don't think there's going to be any major delivery.
Sam, just getting back to North Korea, do you have a sense of what the end game here is? Obviously, without China's support, North Korea would be toast. At some point, presumably, it's inevitable that country is going to collapse in some way. How do we manage that? How do we navigate between South Korea and China to make sure that does happen when it happens in the most moderate way possible?
Well, man, that's the million-dollar question, right? Or the billion-dollar question. The question with North Korea is whether or not a potential collapse of the regime will be a soft landing or hard landing. And if you factor in the role that China plays, China does not want North Korea to collapse at all because it would result in a huge humanitarian crisis that China simply does not want on their hands, not to mention the fact that North Korea serves as a buffer zone between the military presence of the United States in South Korea and mainland China. So there are a lot of factors here at play, whether or not there's a specific endgame here. I mean, scholars have been debating this for the last 50 years, essentially. And the situation is becoming more and more ambiguous as we deal with a new dictator in North Korea. So to be honest, I can't give you an answer as to what the end game here is. But that's just the situation we're in, and we'll just have to see.
Does it make sense for the US to sustain the same level of military presence that it has in South Korea, that it has had for the past half century moving forward?
Well, it makes sense in the larger context of the pivot to Asia, right? So President Obama has been working on this pivot or rebalance to Asia, whichever phrase you like to say. And the idea is that 60% of the U.S. Navy will be stationed in the Asia Pacific, and they'll be there on a rotational basis. A lot of people forget the fact that the biggest base in South Korea is in the heart of Seoul, in Yongsan. They're actually relocating that base to Pyeongtaek right now, which will serve both as an army and a naval base because it's on the coast. So the presence absolutely makes sense. There's some strategic shifts that are happening to accommodate the rotational system that they're implementing. But I think that the U.S. presence in South Korea, as well as Japan and Singapore and these other Asia-Pacific countries, is completely justified and warranted.
Sam, Scott, and Carl, thanks so much for filling us in. It's great to talk to you. Stay tuned, of course, to plenty more conversations coming up here on HuffPost Live.